The late afternoon traffic on I-90 crawled slow beneath a flat Illinois sky, and Clara Bennett let her shoulders sink against the car seat, finally releasing the tight tension of a 12-hour ER shift. The hum of her engine mixed with distant highway noise, a familiar background track to her exhausted weekdays. As an emergency room nurse at Northwestern Medicine, she was used to holding chaos for other people, calming panicked patients, stabilizing crises, staying steady when everything around her frayed apart. For 10 years, she'd brought that same steady energy home to her family, convinced her consistency was the glue holding everyone together. She worked overtime shifts, skipped personal vacations, and trimmed her own modest budget every single month to wire extra cash to her parents' Schaumburg home, never once asking for anything in return. It was a routine she'd built quietly, out of love and obligation. Her father's construction career had worn down his knees in his 50s, making steady work impossible. Her mother's chronic joint pain kept her from picking up extra income. Her younger siblings, Mark and Lila, had drifted through their 20s, jumping from one unstable gig to the next, racking up small debts and impulse purchases they never could afford to pay off on their own. Clara had stepped into the gap without hesitation, telling herself responsible older siblings simply showed up. Stability, she'd always thought, was its own reward. That Saturday, she'd driven out to the suburbs to help her parents sort through stacks of home paperwork and old medical files. Her mom had mentioned needing help organizing legal documents, too frazzled by daily pain to sort through the messy desk alone. Clara didn't mind. She'd spent countless weekends fixing small problems for her family, repairing their broken laptop, scheduling doctor's appointments, paying outstanding utility bills before late fees hit. It was just what she did. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and her mother's usual vanilla cake, warm and familiar, the kind of suburban comfort she rarely allowed herself in her tiny Lakeview apartment. She'd been halfway through sorting a stack of manila folders on the dining room table when she found it tucked behind old tax returns. A crisp, formally printed estate planning document dated just 2 months prior. At first, she'd assumed it was an updated copy of the old will she'd vaguely heard them discuss, one that split the house and savings evenly between all 3 kids. Curious, she flipped to the asset distribution section, intending to just verify everything was in order. The words on the page stopped, her fingers freezing mid-turn. The primary residence in Schaumburg, all retirement saving accounts, all remaining property assets. Every single item listed was designated solely to Mark Anthony Bennett and Lila. There was no mention of Clara Elizabeth Bennett anywhere in the distribution section. No percentage, no small sum, no residual property share, 0. After 10 years of consistent financial support, of covering medical copays, utility shortfalls, and her siblings' endless emergency bailouts, her parents had legally written her entirely out of their families. Strange, hollow heat spread through her chest, sharp and orienting. She'd seen devastating news hundreds of times in the ER, terminal diagnoses, sudden losses, life-altering accidents. This quiet, intentional paperwork cut deeper than any crisis she'd witnessed at work. This was not a mistake or an oversight. The document was signed, dated, and officially witnessed. It was a deliberate choice. For a long minute, she just stared at the black words, her brain struggling to reconcile the life she'd lived with the truth. She thought of every overtime shift she'd worked to cover her dad's physicals. She thought of the rent money she'd sent when Lila's retail got cut, the last-minute cash she'd wired when Mark's fell through, the holidays she'd skipped to pick up extra shifts so her parents wouldn't struggle through winter utility costs. She'd once complained, never demanded repayment, never gratitude. She'd simply believed her family saw her effort, viewed her loyalty. When her parents walked back into the dining room after yard work, Clara held up the document, her voice unsteady. Stripped of all her composure, "I found this new will. Weren't I listed anywhere?" Her mother's smile faded instantly, replaced by a of tension. Her father shifted his weight, staring at the floor and eating her eyes, clearly on confrontation. "It's just, honey," Susan said quickly, rushing to soften the edge of the truth where Clara could process it. "Mark and Lila struggle much more than you do. You have a stable career, great benefits, a steady paycheck. You don't need money, or our house. They're always one bad month away apart completely." Clara's throat tightened, disbelief bleeding into quiet hurt. "I've been sending you money every month for 10 years, she said, only cracking. "I covered Dad's bills when he couldn't work. I bailed Mark and spent his paycheck. I paid your winter utilities 2 years in a row. I've sacrificed so much of my own money and time to keep this family afloat. How is it fair that I get nothing?" Richard finally looked up, his tone firm and unyielding, the traditional mindset he'd always hidden under quiet kindness finally surfacing. "This doesn't mean equal, Clara. It means the kids who need it most. You've built a good life for your siblings haven't. We're looking out for them themselves." The words landed heavy and final, stripping away every unspoken assumption Clara had carried for a decade. Parents were not making an oversight. They were making a choice. Her loyalty, her sacrifice, her endless quiet support had never ending in the family. Her stability was not it was penalized. Her siblings' irritability was not held against rewarded. She set the will down on the table, her hands trembling slightly. Every warm memory of family holidays and quiet sinking into disappointment. The familiar, safe version of her family she'd clung to for years, shattered completely in that moment. Feel the same again. So this is intentional, she said softly. Statement, not a question, but a final, painful acceptance. You're deliberately leaving me out of responsible. Susan sighed sharply, crossing her arms, her tone shifting from gentle to quiet reprimand. Don't be bitter, Clara. We thought you'd understand. This is how we choose to take care of our family. The word bitter hung in the air of the dining room like a damp weight, thick and suffocating. Clara stared at her mother, stunned by how easily the label slid off her tongue, as if a decade of unpaid labor and quiet sacrifice entitled her to nothing more than resentment. She'd spent her entire adult life showing up for this family without complaint, and now that she'd finally dared to question their unfair choice, she was the one at fault. Before Clara could respond, the front door slammed open, cutting through the tense silence. Heavy footsteps thudded across the entryway floor, and the sound of laughter and jangling car keys spilled into the house. Mark and Lila were home, returning from a weekend shopping trip they'd conveniently funded with the last $200 Clara had sent their parents the week prior. Clara recognized the paper shopping bags immediately, fashion boutique logos she'd never once allowed herself to splurge on, despite her steady income and years of putting everyone else first. Lila wandered into the dining room first, twirling a new silver bracelet around her wrist, her expression bright and oblivious to the charged atmosphere. Mark followed close behind, tossing a hoodie over his shoulder, his eyes darting straight to the will laid out on the table. The split second of knowing glance they exchanged was instantaneous, and it froze Clara in place. They weren't surprised. They weren't confused. They had known about the new will all along. What's going on in here? Lila asked, feigning casual curiosity as she leaned against the door. Her tone was light, almost playful, a deliberate contrast to the tears stinging the backs of Clara's eyes. Why is everyone so... Susan stepped forward instantly, shifting into damage control mode, rushing to shield the younger siblings from the confrontation she'd helped create. Your sister's just upset about some paperwork. She's under a lot of stress from work and taking it out on the... The gaslighting was soft and the kind of quiet manipulation that had shaped Clara's entire childhood. It rewrote the truth into, turning her valid pain into workplace mode, her justified anger into overreaction, her sacrifice into petty greed. Richard nodded in agreement, his jaw choosing to back his wife's narrative rather than acknowledge Clara. I'm not stressed from work, Clara said, her voice steady now, edged with a quiet desperation he heard. I'm hurt because I've spent 10 years supporting this family while my parents plan to give everything to the two people who never lift a finger to help. That's not a stress reaction. That's disappointment. Mark let out a short, mocking laugh, sauntering over to the table and picking up the will like it was a trivial piece of junk mail, rather than a legal document rewriting their family future. Come on, Clara, don't be dramatic. Mom and Dad know what they're doing. You're a nurse with a 401k and health insurance. You're set for life. Me and Lila, we're just by. Getting by? Clara repeated, her gaze flicking to the overflowing shopping. You guys just came from shopping. I paid your grocery bill, Mark. I covered Lila's phone bill 3 months in a row. You aren't just by. You're spending money I earned on luxury items while my parents reward your... Lila's smile dropped then, her casual demeanor melting in. She pushed the doorframe, her voice sharp and whiny, the fragile victim act she'd weaponized since childhood slipping right. Wow, okay, now it's being cruel. We don't ask for your help, Clara. You always volunteer. No one wants you to send money. If you're so unhappy helping your family, maybe you should have just kept it all to you. The words not... That was the crux of it, she realized. Her family had never viewed her support as kindness. They saw obligation, as something she owed them simply she was older, stable, because she refused to be selfish like they were. Every dollar she'd sent, every weekend she'd sacrificed, every problem she'd fixed had never been enough to earn her equality, only education. Stepped in then, his tone firm and final, the voice of authority settling over the room. Conversation is over. The will is finalized, and we aren't changing it. Your mother and I have thought long and hard about this. You have a career that will carry you through your whole life. Your brother and sister don't have that security. It's our job as parents to take care of those who need it most. What about the kid who took care of you? Clara asked quietly, breaking again. Who took care? Dad couldn't work. Who took care of you when your medical bills piled up? Who took care of them when they spent every paycheck they earned? Where was my care? Sue's face hardened completely, the last trace vanishing. You're acting entitled, Clara. Attitude looks terrible on you. We raised you, gave you a roof and an education. The rest is not our responsibility. You need to grow up and stop throwing a tantrum of nothing. Nothing. 10 years of overtime shifts, skipped holidays, personal financial sacrifice, and endless emotion reduced to nothing. Clara felt her chest constrict, the familiar burnout from her ER days mixing with a fresh, aching heartbreak. In the hospital, pain was always valid. Every patient fear, every loss, every stretched and cared for. But here in the home a decade protecting, her pain, bitterness, and greed. Mark folded the will and set it back on the table, his tone casual and unapologetic, as if he hadn't just been gifted their parents' entire life's work for free. Look, I get it, it sucks. But life's not always fair. You'll be fine. Me and Lila need the house to settle down. This is our chance to finally get stable. Stable? Laughed bitterly, shaking her head. Stability doesn't inheriting a house you didn't earn. Stability from showing up, working hard, taking responsibility for your life, chosen to do. Lila eyes and turned to their parents, her voice dropping into a soft, manipulative murmur designed to empathy straight from them. See, this is why I never say anything. It always makes us feel terrible for struggling. She's better than us because she's... In an instant, room shifted against Clara. Her parents softened with pity for Lila, then zeroing back in on Clara. Narrative was fully cemented. She was the arrogant, ungrateful oldest sibling, bullying her poor, struggling younger brother and sister over money. Her sacrifices were erased entirely, was rewritten as cruelty. Clara looked around at the four people she spent her adult life protecting and supporting, and for the first time ever, she felt like a complete stranger in her own family. They were united against her, favoritism and shared denial, while she stood alone with the truth. She grabbed her jacket off the back of the chair, her movements slow and deliberate. No longer willing to beg for understanding, she would, "I'm not doing more," she said quietly, despite the tears burning her eyes. "I'm not apologizing for being responsible. I'm not bitter for asking for basic fairness." Susan sighed loudly, crossing her arms again. "So now you're punishing us?" Exactly the selfish attitude about. Clara didn't respond. She didn't have the energy with a family that refused to see. She walked through the front door, the familiar scent of vanilla and cleaner fading, and climbed back into her car. The suburban street was quiet, lined with neat lawns and parked cars, the picture of perfect family normalcy, an illusion she could no longer believe in. As she pulled onto the main road, her phone lit up with a text from her mom, short and sharp, finalizing the day's cruel reality. "We hope you'll calm down soon, ending our family's peace." Staring at the screen, Clara realized the terrible truth. Her family wasn't just unfair. They were actively rewriting history to make her the villain. And if she didn't fight back soon, it'd convince everyone, including herself, she was the one who was wrong all along. The drive back to Chicago felt quieter than usual, the rush of suburban traffic blending into a dull, distant hum. Clara kept her phone face down in the passenger seat, still unable to shake the sting of her mother's text. For 10 years, she'd molded her life around her family's needs, adjusting her schedule, her budget, and even her feelings to keep the peace. She'd always believed that kindness would eventually be recognized, that consistency would earn her the same love and favor her younger siblings received by doing nothing at all. By the time she pulled into the street outside her Lakeview apartment, that belief had fully burned away. She parked her car, climbed the narrow stairwell, and stepped into her small, tidy unit. The space was plain compared to her parents' spacious suburban home. Neutral walls, secondhand furniture, minimal decor. Because every year, she'd funneled extra income toward her family instead of improving her own life. She'd delayed vacations, skipped upgrading her old car, and avoided splurges so she could keep her parents comfortable and bail Mark and Lila out of their constant financial holes. Standing alone in her quiet living room, she finally saw how absurd the imbalance had become. Clara dropped her jacket on the couch and walked straight to her banking app. Every month, without fail, she'd set up an automatic recurring transfer of $300 to her parents' checking account. It was a routine she'd built in her mid-20s, back when her father's injuries first limited his work hours, a small sacrifice she'd been happy to make to ease their stress. Over the years, it had become an unspoken expectation, one her family had slowly taken for granted until it felt like a mandatory payment rather than voluntary support. Her finger hovered over the cancel button for a long moment. Part of her trembled with old guilt, the voice her parents had planted in her head whispering that she was being cruel, that responsible older children didn't cut off their family, that she was letting resentment turn her cold. But behind that guilt was the clearer, sharper truth. She had given and given and given, and her family had only rewarded her loyalty with a rate. If stability was the reason she deserved nothing, then she would no longer let her stability prop up their instability. She canceled the transfer. The action was small, digital, almost invisible, but it was the first real boundary she had ever set with her family. For the first time in a decade, she was choosing herself over their endless demands. She exhaled a shake, feeling both terrified and like she'd finally stopped carrying a weight no one had ever asked her to set. She didn't have to wait long for the fallout. Early the next morning, before she even left for her hospital shift, her phone began blowing up. First a flurry of text messages, then missed calls, one after, all from... Susan never texted briefly when she would. She sent paragraphs stacked with guilt and disappointment, each message designed to chip away at Clara's new. We just tried to. Why aren't you answering? The automatic transfer didn't go through this morning. Did you stop it? This is exactly what we were talking about. You're punishing us because you didn't. Your dad's prescription refill is due this week. We rely on that, Clara. How can you be heartless? Clara read through the message slowly, her earlier resolve hardening into calm. They didn't wonder it's hurt. They didn't ask how she was feeling after yet. They only noticed the missing money and immediately framed her boundaries cruelty. It confirmed everything. Their love for her had always been tied solely to them. She had a single, unemotional reply, refusing to apologize or explain herself. I'm pausing monthly support indefinitely. I've contributed consistently for 10 years without recognition or fairness. Until we can talk respectfully and honestly about the inheritance and treatment of me, there will be no more financial from me. The reply instantly, and the phone exploded again seconds later, call ringing nonstop. Clara silenced her ringer, slipped her scrub top work. The ER busy as always. The chaos of emergencies is a kind of refuge. In the hot rules were clear. For it was documented. Care was acknowledged. No one ever dismissed a nurse's consistent labor as nothing or punished stability by rewarding recklessness. The contrast with her family life than ever. Her best friend and co-worker Mia noticed her quiet tension through their shift. While they were charting patient updates side by side at the nurse's station, Mia had known Clara long enough to read the tightness in her shoulders, the way she stared blankly at her screen instead of talking through her rhythm. Family stuff? Mia asked quietly, keeping her voice low so near. Clara nodded tight. For the first time, she told full truth. The will, the favoritism, the way her family had rewritten her sadness. She spoke steady, without drama, just stating the facts she'd spent years in peace. Mia froze, her eyes wide leaf. Cut you out entirely? After you've done for them? Clara, that's not just unfair. That's calculated. They've been letting you carry them so they could save their assets for the kids who refuse to grow up. That's what I'm starting to realize, Clara admitted. Good, Mia said firmly. You finally realize it. You don't owe them lifelong compensation for being the only responsible person in your family. Stopping those payments is the Mia's validation grounded her, but it didn't stop her from mounting. By the end of her voicemail was full. Her father had left a gruff, disappointed message saying she was being childish and breaking the family apart. Lila had sent a passive-aggressive voice note complaining that Clara's attitude was stressing their parents out, everyone miserable. Mark had texted gently, blunt and "You're being petty. Start paying again or don't bother her again." The threats didn't anger, they saddened her. This was all they had. No apology, no reflection, attempt to understand her pain, and ultimatums. That night, her mother called one time and Clara finally answered, ready to hold her boundary steady. Susan's voice cracked the second she spoke, manufactured grief. Do you want to destroy this family? Is that what you want? We raised you. We loved you. And now starving us over a piece of paper. I'm not starving anyone, Clara said calmly. You have retirement savings. You have Social Security. You have 2 other adult children who could contribute if they chose to. I've been the only one carrying this load for a decade, and I'm done doing it alone while you're the people who never help. This is why we didn't give you a thing. Susan burst out, the mask of raw resentment. You're too independent. You don't need us. Your siblings need us, and we'll take care of them. If you keep this up, lose this family entirely. The words hung over the line, sharp and final. It was no longer a subtle guilt trip or soft gaslight. It was an outright ultimatum. Submit to the unfair, keep paying for everyone's comfort, and accept being written out, cut off from the family entirely. Clara closed her eyes, her heart aching but her resolve unshaken. She had 10 years fearing this exact moment, terrified of being cast out for it to keep her family's love. Now that it was here, the truth no one had ever let her see. A family that threatens abandonment for choosers to begin with. Then I guess we'll find out matters more, he said softly. Or your daughter. She ended the call before her mother could reply, knowing the quiet war between them faded past any easy fix. The old balance was gone forever, and her family was going to let her rebuild it without a fight. The dial tone hummed flat and empty in Clara's ear after she ended the call with her mother, a sound that mirrored the hollow space settling in her chest. She set her phone face down on the kitchen counter, but even out of sight the device felt charged, threatening to buzz, to ping, to flood her quiet apartment with another wave of guilt and accusation. For the first time in her adult life, she had chosen herself over her family, and the victory she'd felt moments ago rapidly dissolved into unrelenting doubt. Boundaries had felt righteous in the heat of conflict. Now, in the stillness of her empty apartment, they felt cruel. She paced her small living room, her mind looping through every word her parents had spoken. You're breaking the family apart. You're being childish. You're too independent. Years of conditioning whispered louder than her newfound resolve. She'd always been the good daughter, the reliable one, the sibling who never caused trouble. For a decade, her identity had been wrapped up in caring for others. Now that she'd stopped giving unconditionally, she struggled to recognize the person she'd become. Rationality fought a losing battle against lifelong guilt. Logically, she knew the will was unfair, that her sacrifice had been endless and unappreciated, that her family's threats were emotional manipulation. But guilt was never rational. It latched onto the smallest, softest parts of her fear. The fear that she was selfish, that she was overreacting, that she would spend the rest of her life alone and estranged from the only family she had. To quiet the noise in her head, she busied herself with trivial chores. She folded laundry, wiped down her kitchen counters, restocked the water bottle she took to work. Every mundane task was a distraction from the question circling her mind on repeat. Am I actually the bad guy? By midnight, her phone was still silent. No more angry texts, no more frantic calls. The absence of conflict was worse than the chaos. It felt like abandonment, like her family had collectively decided to erase her, just as thoroughly as the will had erased her inheritance. The next few days blurred into a cycle of work and quiet over. At the hospital, Clara fell back into the familiar rhythm of caring for others. She soothed anxious patients, comforted grieving families, stayed late to finish charting so her co-workers wouldn't be swamped. In the ER, her kindness was viewed, her effort rewarded with gratitude and respect. It made her family's rejection feel even more disjointed, as if she existed as two separate, affectionate, indispensable caregiver work, and a bitter, ungrateful job. Mia checked in with her gently, sending encouraging texts and pulling her aside during breaks to reinforce what Clara already knew, but struggled. You did thing, Mia repeated during the break, handing Clara a warm coffee from the hospital. Letting people take advantage of you is kindness. I know, Clara said, staring down at the steam curl of the cup. But what if I'm cutting them off when they actually help? What if Dad's prescription really is late? What if I'm punishing out of pride? Mia sighed, leaning against the wall. Clara, you've spent 10 years prioritizing their needs over yours. When have they ever prioritized yours? Never once. This isn't punishment. Balance. Clara nodded, but didn't stick. The doubt had too deep. Her family voice was older, louder, more ingrained than friends' logic. She found herself replaying every family memory, searching for proof they loved her, that the unfair was a mistake, that she was blowing everyone. She fixated on childhood moments. Her mother bandaged scraped knees, her father told her to ride a bike, convinced those tiny kindnesses must negate. Her family's radio silence finally the fourth day. But it was not the apology or conversation she'd hoped for. Instead of reaching out to understand her pain, they went passive-aggressively public with a version of the story. Lila posted a photo on Instagram of her and Mark sitting on their parents' backyard patio, the caption optimizing, family stress the most. Some people choose bitterness over peace. Grateful always. Mutual cousins and extended family members minutes. And knew the full truth. No one knew about Clara's decade of payments, her skipped holidays, sacrifices. All they saw was a single stable nurse, seemingly turning her belly. Clara's stomach dropped as she threw the comments, filled with sympathetic messages for Lila and vague digs at unnamed members. Her siblings were painting her as the villain to the entire extended family, and they were doing it quietly, irreversibly. She fell for the recting. Convinced she was being unreasonable, desperate to salvage her reputation and her family bond. Judgment. She opened her banking app and sent a one-time payment, half usual monthly amount, alongside text. I'm sending temporary Dad's prescription. I still need us to talk honestly about the will treated each other. It was what no one asked for. A peace offering rooted entirely in isolation. She caved, just enough to give her family exactly what they wanted. Boundaries were fragile. Guilt could be manipulated. That she would always fold family together. The respect and cold. Her mother texted back simply, fine. Some maturity. No thank you. No acknowledgement of her effort. No willingness to talk. Just validation that her surrender was expected. And childish. Minutes later, a new story post from Mark. A quick video of him and Lila browsing furniture online, grinning. The text overlay read, upgrades coming soon. Clara froze, her blood running cold. They weren't struggling. They weren't stressing for bills or prescription costs. They were planning renovations on a house they hadn't earned, fully confident that their older sister would keep sacrificing to fund their lifestyle while they inherited everything. Her temporary peace offering hadn't eased their hardship, funded their leisure. In that crushing moment, Clara's worst mistake yet. Doubt hadn't just made her weak. It had made her complicit in her own unfair treatment. Every small compromise she'd made out of fear had only given her family more power to exploit, and she'd walked right into it. And shifted in her favor. It had tilted further against her. And now, surrounded by a family that villainized her publicly and took her kindness for granted, Even her best friend's court felt like a distant life. For the first time in her life, Clara was truly alone, isolated by lies, crippled by self-doubt, and staring down a far worse hill than she'd ever imagined. Clara set her phone down on the coffee table, her fingers still stiff from scrolling Mark's careless social media story. The rush of cold clarity that washed over her drowned out every last trace of her earlier guilt. For days, she'd tortured herself wondering if she was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too quick to pull away from the family she'd spent a decade propping up. She'd convinced herself that her parents' worry was genuine, that her siblings' instability was unavoidable, that the unfair will was rooted in misguided concern, rather than deliberate favoritism. But watching them scroll through luxury furniture options minutes after she'd sent money for her father's medication stripped away every last excuse. Her doubt curdled into sharp, focused resolve. She was no longer fighting to be seen as the good daughter. She was fighting to uncover the full truth behind why she'd been erased so completely. She knew her family's pattern well by now. They survived on vague narratives, half-truths, and carefully curated hardship. Mark and Lila told their parents they were one emergency away from ruin, and her parents never bothered to verify the details. They accepted the victim's story at face value, because it was easier than confronting the reality of their younger children's poor choices, and far more convenient than acknowledging Clara's quiet, unending loyalty. Determined to break that narrative, Clara dug through years of digital receipts and transaction histories that night. As an ER nurse who often worked chaotic, unpredictable hours, she'd developed a habit of archiving every payment, every transfer, every small financial favor she'd ever extended to her family. She'd never done it for leverage or proof. She'd done it simply to stay organized, to track her own tight budget, to make sure she could continue helping without sinking her own finances. Now, those archived records became the evidence no one had ever bothered to gather. She sorted through the files methodically, her exhaustion fading into quiet urgency. Year after year, the pattern emerged unmistakably. She'd covered her father's physical therapy copays for 3 straight years, when his construction injuries left him unable to work full-time. She'd paid her mother's recurring migraine medication refills out of pocket, even when her parents insisted they had it covered. She'd sent emergency rent assistance to Mark twice when his gig work fell. Covered Lila's retail uniform costs and monthly phone bills more times than she could get, and even paid their parents' winter heating bills during 2 brutal Illinois winters to keep the house from falling behind on utilities, while she'd been draining her overtime earnings to keep the household afloat. Her siblings had been burning through their own sporadic income on disposable luxury purchases they'd never admit to. Scattered Venmo receipts and old shared bank alerts she'd been CC'd on told the full story. Concert tickets, designer clothing, weekend bar outings, last-minute road trips, an expensive restaurant. Their constant struggle was never a battle to pay us. It was a refusal to prioritize needs over wants, a lifestyle of immediate gratification they'd trained their parents to sub, and trained Clara. The most devastating detail surfaced when she cross-referenced. The 2 months her parents finalized the new inheritance lined up perfectly with the most reckless stretch of her siblings' spending. Mark had leased a new truck he could not afford. Lila had splurged on an expensive boutique shopping spree and a weekend lake trip with friends, instead of reining their children in. Her parents had rewarded their irresponsibility by locking in an estate plan that guaranteed lifelong security for the 2 least self-sufficients of the family at the total expense on who had nothing. Clara sat in her chair, staring at the screen of proof, and felt a strange, mournful calm settle over her. This was not a case of loving parents favoring vulnerable kids. This was a case of willful blindness. Her parents had chosen to believe dramatic, messy hardship stories because those stories required no accountability for her. Her stability made her overlook, take for granted, easily. Next morning, she drove out to the suburb again, not to beg for fairness or plead for understanding, but to confront the gap between their lies and the documented truth. She arrived early, knowing parents would be home, and found them sitting on the back patio with Mark and Lila, casually flipping through home magazines. Their stomach. While she'd spent years scrimping and sacrificing to keep the household stable, they'd been planning kitchen remodels and backyard upgrades with her. "I talked to all of you," Clara said, stepping onto the patio, her voice steady and unshaken. No more tears, no more guilt, no hesitant questioning. She was done letting them frame her bitterness. Susan looked up, her expression defensive. "We discussed this, Clara." "I'm not here to argue about the will right now," replied. "I'm here to talk about what you've all been hiding. You claim Mark and Lila need this house and this money because they struggle to get by. But I have 2 years of receipts proving they've been spending their income on luxury trips, new vehicles, and non-essential purchases while I pay for your household bills." Mark's casual smile dropped instantly. He sat defensive and sharp. "That's none of your business. How I see is my choice. It becomes my business when you use your fake hardship to steal inheritance you didn't earn," Clara shot back. "It becomes my business when my parents write me out of everything you're desperate, while you're browsing for a kitchen upgrade." Lila stood up, her eyes flashing with anger, the fragile victim at crumbling away completely. You're just jealous. A good job and a nice life. And you hate that we're finally going to have something stable for once. Stable? Clara shook her relief thick in her tone. Stability isn't a house your sister funded. Stability is working overtime for a decade to make sure your family doesn't fall apart while your siblings pay their way through every paycheck. You don't deserve what you never worked for. Richard slammed his magazine shut, his voice rising in frustration. Enough, this is greed, plain and simple. We don't care about their spending habits. We care about giving them a future they can't build for themselves. You've built yours. Let them have theirs. The words landed like a final verdict, cold and unyielding. Even faced with undeniable proof that their favoritism is based on fabricated hardship, refused to budge. They did not care that they'd punished responsibility. They did not care that erased a decade of sacrifice. They only cared about protecting the narrative they'd built their unfair choices. In that moment, Clara understood her family's betrayal. It was not a mistake. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, ongoing choice to reward weakness and exploit kindness, to value the noisy, neat demands of her siblings over the quiet she'd given for years. She looked at the four of them, united in denial, energetic in their unfairness, completely unbothered by the truth, and felt the last thread of loyalty fray completely. She was no longer sad about losing her family's favor. She was sobered by the realization that she had never truly had it at all. You can keep the house. You can keep the savings. You keep every asset you've decided to give them, Clara said firmly, her voice clear and unwavering. But don't ever again about helping struggling kids. This is about reward entitlement, and I'm done paying for it. As she turned to walk away, Susan's voice through the air, sharp and unforgiving, delivering the final blur into her darkest chapter yet. If you walk out that door with food, her mother said coldly, you walk out of this family for good. Clara drove home from the Schaumburg suburbs in complete silence, the weight of her mother's ultimatum pressing heavier on her chest than any ER burnout she'd ever endured. The suburban streetlights blurred past her windshield, warm and golden for every house on the block but hers, a quiet, visual echo of the family life she'd just lost. For 10 years, she'd structured every choice around keeping this family intact. She'd bent her budget, her schedule, and her self-worth to fit their needs, convinced that consistent love would eventually earn her consistent belonging. Now she understood that her loyalty had never been enough, because loyalty was never what they wanted from her. They wanted compliance. She'd expected anger after her confrontation. She'd expected arguments, defensiveness, even weeks of tension. What she had not expected was a full, coordinated family erasure. Within 24 hours, her parents and siblings had rewrote the entire narrative to every extended relative, every family friend, every person who'd ever known their household dynamic. By sunrise the next morning, Clara was no longer the dedicated, sacrificing oldest daughter. She was the greedy, bitter, ungrateful child who'd abandoned her aging parents and bullied her struggling siblings over money. Her phone did not stop buzzing. Texts flooded in from cousins, aunts, and distant family members who'd never once asked how much she gave, only how dare she finally stop giving. One cousin texted, "Family isn't about what you get. It's about what you give. You're acting so selfish." An aunt left a voicemail tearful with disappointment, saying she'd always thought Clara was the mature, compassionate one, shocked to see her destroy her family over material gain. No one asked for her side. No one checked in to see if she was hurt. Everyone rushed to moralize her boundaries as betrayal. The worst part was how effectively her immediate family weaponized silence. Her parents did not correct the rumors. Mark and Lila continued posting passive-aggressive social media content, vague captions about hurtful family betrayal and undeserved conflict, letting the likes and sympathetic comments pile up to cement their victim status. They did not lie right. They simply omitted. And omission, Claire learned, was the cruelest form of family manipulation. Work. She could barely hold herself. The ER was typically her safe space, the one place her effort was quantified, valued, and necessary. When she stabilized a patient, she saw tangible proof of her care. When she supported her coworkers, she received gratitude and teamwork in return. But that shift, every small crisis put together. She found herself staring off mid-conversation with patients, her mind looping on the same painful. If my decade of sacrifice meant nothing to my only, what does any of my kind? Mia noticed the crack in her armor instantly. She pulled Clara into the quiet break room shift, shutting the door behind them to block out the hospital chaos, and found her staring blankly at her scrubbed hands, eyes glistening with They turned every me, whispered, her voice raw and exhausted. All I did was stop letting use me. All I wanted was to once, to have my acknowledged. And now I'm the villain of the... Mia leaned the counter, her tone steady, flinching. No soft platitudes in the truth. Because your family's entire system runs on you, sacrifice yourself. Ooh, Clara. The one who absorbs all the instability, covers all the gaps, and keeps everyone comfortable while they don't. When you stop sacrificing, the system breaks. And broken systems always blame the person who stops complying instead of the people who... Shook her head. grief crashing over her. I just don't understand. Can't see it. Why can't they see that I've carried all of them for years? They don't want to see it, replied gently. Seeing it means new gratitude. It means admitting Mark and Lila's struggles are self-created. It means confronting that their favoritism is unfair. It's easier for them to call you bitter than to admit they've been using your were true. But truth did nothing to ease crushing loneliness. That night, Clara went home to her empty Lakeview apartment and faced the full revelation. She had no family to turn to, no one to validate her truth, no one to defend her. Her own blood had unanimously chosen favoritism over fairness, entitlement over sacrifice, and comfortable lies over duty. The final nail in the coffin came late that night, when her mother sent a long, final text that stripped away every last illusion of maternal love. We raised you to be generous, not vengeful. If you cannot let this go and choose peace over money, you have no place in this family. Your siblings need us, and we will not have your pride. That was how they self-respect, vengeful. That was how they labeled her. Clara sat on her couch in the dim lamplight, scrolling through her years of bank records, old holiday photos, and forgotten memories of every time she'd put them first. She saw every Christmas shift she'd to pay their heating bills, every birthday dinner she skipped to cover Mark's rent, every stressful night she'd spent troubleshooting her parents' medical issues alone. She saw a lifetime of quiet and celebrated love, and a family that had spent just taking it for granted. Rock-bottom moment. She finally understood the full, unvarnished truth she'd spent years avoiding. It was never that her parents didn't know how much she sacrificed. It was that they didn't care. Stability was convenient. Generosity was expected. Her silence was the foundation of perfect family illusion. The second she broke that silence, she became the enemy. Her siblings of bad luck. They were beneficiaries of her endless self-abandonment. Her parents were not neutral caregivers trying to support struggling kids. They were complicit enablers, rewarded irresponsibility, and punished responsibility to keep their family dynamic free. For the first time in her life, Clara did not sing her family's love. She cried over wasting years of her life chasing a love that was never real to begin with. When the sun rose the next morning, Clara was no longer trapped in doubt. She was trapped in certainty. The family she'd grieved, the family she'd fought to keep, the sacrificed everything for, had never existed outside imagination. She'd never felt more alone. A quiet, unshakable resolve began to bloom in the emptiness of her loss. If she was going to be labeled the villain for choosing this, for valuing herself, for breaking a toxic cycle, then she would stop trying her they'd never deserved. The old Clara, people-pleasing, guilt-driven vice first always Clara, died in that moment. And in her place, a new version of herself was born. One ready to reacting, start fighting, and reclaim the work spent a lifetime erasing. She picked up her phone, deleted every unread family text, and opened her document folder of proof. If we're going to wage a war on her character, she was finally ready to fight back with the thing their lies beat, the truth. Morning light filtered through Clara's apartment windows, soft and unassuming, but there was nothing gentle left in her mindset. The fog of grief and self-doubt that had clung to her for weeks had burned off completely during her lowest night. What remained was clear, unclouded resolve. She was no longer scrambling to fix the family, to beg for recognition, or to prove she was a good daughter. She was done reacting to their attacks. Today, she would start building her own defense. She spent her day off systematically organizing every record she'd saved over the past decade. She compiled monthly transfer receipts, emergency Venmo payments, pharmacy copay confirmations, utility bill coverages, and even old text threads where her parents and siblings explicitly asked for financial help. She sorted them into a simple, chronological folder. No exaggeration, no emotional framing, just cold, unarguable proof of consistent sacrifice. Every entry dated, every dollar accounted for, every favor documented. For years she'd kept these records out of habit. Now they were her only weapon against the character assassination spreading through her family's circle. Clara understood the core of their strategy now. Her family didn't need to tell outright lies to win the narrative. They only needed to withhold context. By painting her boundary setting as selfish retaliation and omitting years of one-sided financial support, they'd turn truth upside down. To fight back, she didn't need to scream or accuse. She only needed to restore the context they'd erased. Midday, Mia stopped by her apartment with coffee. Finding Clara seated at her dining table surrounded by neatly sorted digital files, her posture steady and focused instead of broken. There were no more teary eyes, no more spiraling doubts. The helplessness that had defined her for weeks was... "You look different," Mia said, setting the mugs down carefully. "I finally stopped trying to win their..." Clara answered without looking up, finishing her final file bowl. "Now I'm just trying to win the..." Mia nodded, a quiet, proud smile tugging at her. "What's your next move?" "I'm calling their bluff." "They want a family meeting? I'll give them one. I'm requesting a single formal family meeting. No social media spectators. No extended relatives weighing in from the sidelines. Just the four of them. Face to face. No more vague subtweets. No more secondhand gossip. Everything gets laid out in front of the people actually. Clara drafted the text calmly, without anger or desperation. She kept it factual, firm, and guilt, refusing to give them any opening to twist her words into I'd like a private family meeting this weekend. No outside guests, no distractions. We will discuss the inheritance, the long-term financial dynamic of the household, and the ongoing misrepresentation of my choices to family members. I will be bringing documentation to clarify all ongoing She hit send and left her phone, refusing to fixate on their immediate. For the first time, she held her peace instead of begging. The family's reply within minutes. Her mother texted back sharply. This is unnecessary drama. The will is final. We have nothing to discuss. Clara didn't flinch. She sent one follow-up message. Unyielding. You don't get to publicly smear my character and refuse to discuss the privately. Meeting or I start correcting the narrative with every family member you've misled. Your choice. It was her first true ultimatum and landed perfectly. She was no longer the one with whose. They were the ones living in the shadow of fat perfection, reliant on everyone believe her victim narrative. If Clara backed that layer, their reputation as the struggling innocent family. An hour later, her father sent a short confirmation. Afternoon. In the day leading up to the meeting, the family's behavior visibly. The cocky confidence Mark and Lila had carried faded in ease. They stopped posting passive-aggressive content online, stopped subtweeting Betrayal, and kept their interactions with Clarence. They were used to her folding, apologizing, backing down. They had no idea how to handle a version of her that's spoken. Her parents, too, grew tense and irritable, snapping at each other over small household tasks, clearly anxious about what Clara's documentation would reveal. The first time in years, the balance was shifting. The family that had once held all the emotional control now feared expose. Still, they clung to their arrogance, convinced they could outmaneuver her with elation. Lila sent a laugh to rattle her. You're really going to ember money? That's so cold. Clara didn't reply. She no longer needed to justify herself to people. Saturday afternoon, gray and crisp. A typical Chicago autumn day, sky muted and heavy, matching the charged atmosphere household. Clara drove to the suburbs with her folder of evidence securely on her phone, or grieving. She felt ground steady and prepared. She knew this would not fix her family. It would not make them fair or loving, but it would end their ability to lie about her gently. He stepped through the front door. This was suffocating. Mark and Lila sat stiffly on the couch, no longer browsing renovation casually. Parents stood near the kitchen counter, their faces tight and unforgiving, ready to till the end. Expected tears. They expected begging. They expected her to cave halfway through and apologize. They did not expect her to sit down calmly, unlock her phone and say one quiet, devastating line that flipped. Let's the truth you've all been hiding, Clara said evenly. For 10 years I funded this household while my siblings waited on luxury purchases. And you rewrote history to reward and punish my work. Today, everyone here finally listens. The room went dead quiet. The casual defiance Mark and Lila had worn like armor vanished in an instant, replaced by a skittish, unguarded tension. Her parents' jaws tightened, their practiced, righteous anger faltering for the first time since this conflict began. They'd spent weeks painting Clara as the irrational, money-obsessed child, certain they could overwhelm her with guilt and family pressure. But sitting across from her now, they realized she hadn't come to argue or plead. She'd come to prove her case. Clara set her phone on the coffee table, screen bright and open to her organized folder of records, and leaned back in the armchair, calm and unrushed. No shaking hands, no cracking voice, no desperate attempts to make them feel sorry for her. She was simply a person laying out facts for a family that had spent years refusing to face them. 2 years ago, she began, her tone steady and unemotional. I covered Dad's knee therapy copays for 6 straight months while he couldn't work. That same quarter, Mark leased a new truck and dropped $800 on concert tickets. Lila booked a weekend lake getaway and bought $300 worth of boutique clothes. I have the dates, the transfer confirmations, every receipt. Mark shifted forward on the couch, his defensive tone sharp and flustered. That's my money. I earned it. I can spend it how I want. You absolutely can. Clara agreed without hesitation, derailing his argument before he could twist it into victimhood. But you cannot spend your money on luxury trips and new vehicles, then turn around and tell our parents you're too financially unstable to ever inherit less than me. You can't live beyond your means voluntarily, then demand family compensation for your own poor choice. She swiped to the next set of records, her gaze sweeping over all 4 of them, unflinching. Last winter, I paid this house's full heating bill and Mom's migraine medication refills because you said you couldn't cover the cost. That same month, Lila upgraded her phone and bought a designer jacket. You both told our parents you were barely scraping by. You let them believe you were one emergency away from ruin, while you spent freely on anything but necessity. Lila's face flushed red with frustration, her soft victim act crumbling completely. Why are you policing every single thing? You're just mad we get to have nice things now. I'm not policing you, Clara said. I'm correcting the lie you've built this entire inheritance on. This will isn't a kindness to struggling kids. It's a payout for 2 adults who lied about their hardship to get special treatment. And my parents went along with it because it was easier than acknowledging how much She turned her gaze to her voice softening but never wavering, no longer angry, just. For 10 years I skipped overtime bonuses for myself, delayed upgrading the car, and never took a real vacation so I could make sure this house never fell behind. I did it because I loved you and wanted to ease your stress. I never had it. Never demanded favors, never complained. All I ever wanted was equal. Richard's stern expression wavered, his tough paternal facade cracking edges. He stared at the phone screen, scanning the dated receipts and payment records he'd never bothered by. A quiet guilt flickers. Susan, ever stubborn, rushed to salvage their crumbling narrative, her voice tight. Even if they spent foolishly, they still don't have your security. You have a career, benefits, savings. I have security because for it. Clara cut in gently. I worked 12-hour ER shifts, pulled overtime every holiday, and lived below my means for a decade while I support you. My security isn't luck. It's sacrifice. The same sacrifice you refused to reward and let my mock. The room had no bottle left. Mark stood at his shoes, silent for the first time in conflict. Lila crossed arms tightly, her eyes glistening not with hurt, but with embarrassment. For weeks they'd held the power of public narrative and favoritism. In 30 minutes, Clara's quiet, factual proof had stripped every. The power balance was no longer shifted. It was conversed, cornered and excuses. Susan attempted a weak last compromise, a desperate bid to save face and end the meeting before truths came out. If this is truly about fairness, we can end slightly. We can set aside a small portion of for you, Clara. Get even. Clara let out a quiet, breathy laugh, devoid of joy. After a decade of total sacrifice, after being completely erased from their legacy, after being labeled bitter and selfish for one basic equality, the best her family could often crumb. A tiny afterthought to silence her, not honor her. No, said simply. The same word hung in the air, shocking all of them. Expected relief, gratitude, willingness to negotiate. None of them. I don't want your leftover money or token adjustment, Clara continued, standing from her chair, ready to leave the toxic tent of the house behind her. I don't want a portion of an inheritance I earned in blood's years. I don't want you fixing this halfway to clear your guilty conscience. Wanted was fairness, and you chose favoritism, longer questioned it. She locked her phone, tucking it into her pocket, all her evidence secure. The will stays as it is. Let Mark and Lila have the house and the savings. They've spent years earning it, lies and entitlement. I'm done competing family. Richard stood abruptly, his gruff and uneasy, authority. Clara, don't away from us over pride. Clara paused at the door, glancing back at people who'd raised her, used her, and discarded her. Family doesn't reward irresponsibility and erase sacrifice. Family doesn't publicly villainize the person who keeps everyone afloat. You stopped being my family the day you wrote me out of your future to reward. I stepped onto the front porch, the cool autumn wind brushing her face. She heard the sound of quiet, frantic erupting inside the house. Parents turning on their favored children, siblings lashing out at each other without the common enemy of Clara to unify them. The perfect, peaceful family facade they'd clung to for shattered entirely. The balance stood against her. For the first time in this entire fight, all the power. But as she walked to her car, she knew the final, unavoidable showdown was no longer a question of if, question of when. And when it came, she would not be the one begging for mercy. The week following the explosive family meeting unfolded in tense, fractured silence. The chaotic arguments Clara had heard through the open front door lingered in the back of her mind long after she'd driven back to Chicago. For the first time in years, the Bennett family's carefully polished unity had cracked open to reveal the rot beneath it all, a fragile piece built entirely on Clara's self-sacrifice. Now that she'd stopped giving, everything was falling apart. They did not give her space to heal. Instead, they bombarded her with a new, desperate wave of manipulation, one softer, sneakier, and far more insidious than their prior anger. Having lost every logical argument, every shred of moral high ground, and every excuse for their favoritism, they switched tactics entirely. Guilt became their last remaining weapon. It started with her father's text late that night, stripped of its usual stern authority, thick with manufactured frailty. Your mother hasn't slept since the meeting. She's heartbroken that you think we don't love you. We only ever tried to protect your siblings. Hours later, Lila sent a tearful voice note, ditching her arrogance entirely to revert to the helpless little sister act she'd weaponized her whole life. She cried about feeling attacked, about being unfairly judged, about how Clara's cruel honesty had split the family apart. Mark followed up with a blunt, bitter text, no longer defensive about his spending, but petty and wounded. You got your truth out there. You happy now? You ruined everything. Clara read every message, listened to every shaky voice note, and felt no urge to cave. She saw the pattern clear as day. This was not remorse. This was damage control. They weren't upset about hurting. They were upset that she'd stopped letting them hurt her for free. 2 days later, Susan called with a quiet, trembling plea, her tone unrecognizable from the cold, unforgiving mother of weeks prior. She begged Clara to come back one last time, insisting they could fix this together, that they could make things right, that they just needed one more chance as a Against every instinct that now screamed self-preservation, Clara, she needed this final meeting for her. She needed to close this chapter clean, to end the cycle of false hope that had haunted her for a decade. She knew deep down nothing would, but she needed to hear their final answer to fully. She returned to the Schaumburg house on a muted Sunday afternoon. The autumn air sharp and cold, the suburban streets quiet and lightless. The house felt different, no longer warm with childhood nostalgia, but hollow and a stage set for a family that no longer. They were waiting for her, lined up in the living room with solemn, guilty faces, ready to deliver their carefully rehearsed compromise. Susan spoke first, slow and gentle, choosing every word to tug at Clara's last threads of familiar. We've talked through, she softly. We were wrong to write you out entirely. We see how much you've given and we're sorry. We've decided to split the inheritance 3 ways, equally. House, savings, everything. All split evenly between of you. Does that fix it? Does that bring our girl to us? A heartbeat. Clara felt an old, familiar hope. The childish, desperate hope she'd carried since she was 20 years old, begging silently for her family. But the hope died instantly when she saw the way Mark and Lila sat at the floor, jaws tight, eyes burning resentment. This was not a syllogy. This was a forced bargain. They weren't giving her They were offering her scraps to erase the truth exposed, to restore their perfectly image, to make her forgive and forget so they could go to their easy, privileged lives. Looked at her parents, searching their eyes for genuine remorse, for recognition of lost years, for regret over the decades of unfairness. She found none, only fear. Fear of passion, fear of harmony, fear of facing the consequences. How? Asked quietly. Susan blinked. The question. Because we view. No, Clara cut in, whispering. You're doing this now because expose the truth. You're doing this now because your perfect narrative broke. You didn't offer me equality when I worked overtime to pay your bills. You didn't offer me equality when I bailed my siblings out of their reckless choices. You didn't offer me equality when I spent 10 years holding this family up alone. You're offering it now only because I stopped letting you use me. She paused, letting the weight of her words set the silent room, over their guilty, avoiding gazes. This isn't fair, she continued. This is damage control. You don't want to make things fair. You just want me to stop being hurt enough. Richard's agile composure snapped. Gentle act fell away, revealing the same stubborn favoritism that had all along. What do you want from us, Clara? We're giving you equal shares. We're apologizing. You're being ungrateful and unyielding. I want what I've always wanted, Clara said firmly. I want you to admit my responsibility. I want you to admit you rewarded their laziness. I want you to acknowledge that I was never the problem. Your choice to favor the loyal was. Crashed over the room. No one spoke. No one apologized. No one conceded, in that devastating quiet, her final answer. Her family would never choose fairness over favoritism. They'd never validate her sacrifice. They'd never love her without conditions, without repayment, compliance. Mark finally lifted his head, voice sharp and bitter, to be remorseful. This is why we never got you anything. This is why we left you out. You're never satisfied. No matter how much, you always want more. In the coffin. Clara nodded slowly, her heart finally settled, peaceful grief. She was not angry anymore. She was not begging anymore. She was simply done. Okay, she said, all I needed to hear. She turned to her parents, her voice steady and final, closing the gate of devotion and heartbreak. I decline your equal split. I don't want any part of your inheritance. I don't want your house. I don't want your savings. I don't want a piece of it who loves me when I'm serving them. Susan's eyes widened in shock. Clara, don't do this. Nothing, Clara said. I'm finally stopping. I'm stopping the monthly payments. I'm stopping the bailouts. I'm stopping the endless sacrifice. You can keep every asset but you will no longer keep me. Richard's face darkened with helpless rage. You're throwing your family away over pride. I'm throwing a toxic cycle, Clara corrected. Pride is wanting reward for nothing. I'm choosing giving everything for nothing. She took one last look at the fool who'd shaped her entire adult life. Her parents who chose favoritism. Her siblings who chose entitlement. family that had turned her loyalty into a flaw, sacrifice into an expectation. From today forward, she said clearly, definitively, I am no longer your provider. I am no longer peacekeeper. I am no longer your scapegoat. If you want to keep your fractured, unfair family built on lies and exploit it, I'm choosing me. With that, she walked out of the house for the last time, their shouts, their guilt, their demands, and their broken system behind her. The door clicked shut softly behind her, and for the first time in 10 years, Clara felt completely, unshakably free. The drive back to Chicago was quiet, but it was no longer the hollow, suffocating silence of grief. It was the calm, open stillness of release. The weight she'd carried for a decade, guilt, obligation, the desperate need to be loved and seen by her family, lifted from her shoulders mile by mile. The autumn sunlight broke through the gray cloud cover, spilling golden light over the highway rooftops, a quiet, gentle metaphor for the new clarity settling into her heart. Clara rolled down the window and let the crisp Chicago air fill the car. She no longer replayed the arguments, no longer lingered on her family's cruel words, no longer tortured herself with what-if scenarios of a fairer, kinder family. She had gotten her answer. She had fought for the truth, stood firm in her worth, and walked away without malice, but without regret. In the weeks that followed, her old life slowly faded into the background, making space for something far more genuine and peaceful. Her family attempted several last-ditch efforts to pull her back into their cycle. Her parents sent long, passive-aggressive emails lamenting her coldness. Lila posted vague social media captions about broken family bonds and ungrateful children. Mark sent a heated text accusing her of ruining their future security. But Clara did not open most of the messages, did not reply to their guilt trips, did not allow them to reinsert chaos into her quiet new life. She set firm, unwavering boundaries. No more unplanned calls. No more emotional manipulation. No more self-sacrifice for people who would never value her. For the first time in her adult life, Clara prioritized. She stopped picking up unnecessary overtime shifts solely to cover other people's bills. She saved her extra income for herself, upgrading her aging car, booking the week-long Lake Michigan vacation she'd denied herself for years, and slowly furnishing her apartment into a warm, welcoming space that felt entirely hers. No longer a temporary, sparse living space for a woman always waiting to give her, it became a home rooted in self-care and self-respect. At work, her shift changed. She still cared deeply for her patients, still showed up with the same compassion that defined her as a nurse, but she stopped overextending herself to please others. She stopped covering endless extra shifts for coworkers who took advantage of her. She stopped carrying everyone else's stress while neglecting her own. Her compassion remained intact, but her boundaries were Mia watched her transformation with quiet aid, sitting with her on Clara's new balcony one mild evening as they sipped. You look here, Mia said. Lighter, Clara smiled, staring out at the Chicago skyline glowing in. I am. I spent 10 years defining my worth by how much I thought love meant size. I finally learned love shouldn't cost you your entire. It was not an easy piece. There were quiet nights where she grieved the family she'd once have, the loving, fair, grateful family that existed only in her youthful imagination. She grieved the childhood dreams of belonging, the years she'd wasted chasing love, the quiet sacrifices no one would ever acknowledge. But grief her hurt. It felt tender, final, a necessary goodbye to a version of herself that no longer. She understood now that walking away from a toxic family was not abandonment. It was self-preservation, choosing boundaries over endless obligation. It was maturity. Her siblings would inherit the house, the savings, and every asset her parents had to give. They would live with the comfort of unsecurity, but they would also live with the rot of entitlement, resentment, and a fractured family bond. Already, their once united front had crumbled without her as their common enemy. They bickered over future property splits, argued over trivial money matters, and turned their petty frustration on each other, proving the peace Clara had spent years maintaining was never. Clara. She had something far more valuable than a suburban house or savings: integrity, self-respect, and a future entirely. Months later, her parents sent one final tentative text, a quiet, unadmitted attempt at reconciliation. We miss you. The house. Clara calmly. No anger, no longing. Lie. She knew they missed her because they loved her, but because they missed the steady, reliable support. They missed the daughter who fixed their problems, heard their bills, and absorbed their unfairness. She drafted an emotional reply. No desperate plea for understanding, no angry retort. She simply sent one short, honest message, closed completely. I wish you all well, but I'm no longer sacrificing my peace to belong. I have a life now. That winter, Clara spent her first season alone. Not lonely, but independent. Cooked her favorite meal, decorated her small apartment with warm lights, and celebrated the hard work fought for. For the first time in a decade, she did not spend the holidays working overtime to fund her family's comfort. She did not wait for came. She did not beg for a place at a table that never... As she sat by her window, watching Chicago's winter snow fall, family found herself. The inheritance Eve was not property, not savings, urban house. It was clarity. It was courage. It was the quiet, unshakable knowledge that her worth was never to what she could give others. It was to who she was. The first time in her life, more than enough.